Hello everyone, my name is Micaiah Knock and my virtual rebuttal is for Ashton Gardner and his topic for debate 1, claiming that the United States and NATO allies should be willing to use military forces against Russia. I would like to first start off by saying I do believe that the points that were made within his video were great, and he provided valid reasoning as to why it would be ideal for the United States to use military forces on Russia. But unfortunately, there were flaws to identify within his argument and reasoning as to why I believe that not using military forces on Russia would be the better decision. I decided to focus on 2 points that were made within the debate as to why he believed that the U.S. should use military forces against Russia. One claim that was made was that Russia was violating international law by their attacks on Ukraine and their violation of humanitarian laws against citizens of Ukraine in the necessary areas within Ukraine, as well as the hospitals that affected the individuals there. Although I agree that Russia is violating international law with their unnecessary force against the individuals within Ukraine, if the U.S. were to intervene and use military force against Russia, they would be violating international law as well. Article 24 prevents the U.S. from using military force unauthorized, and they would need permission from the Security Council. When it comes to self-defense under international law, self-defense should be recognized as reactive and not proactive. So individuals would need to do something first for someone to react to that. Individuals such as innocent civilians should not be harmed or affected because they would be violating humanitarian laws. This would also pose risk for war within the U.S. and Russia due to both countries' powerful military and nuclear power. This can pose risk to civilians in both countries as well, and that would violate the humanitarian laws. So it would not be ideal for the U.S. to use the military forces on Russia. That would just cause more conflicts, more problems, and it will cause more harm to individuals. In turn, both treaties of international law would be violated because civilians within both countries would be harmed. Although Russia is currently violating international law, as we discussed in earlier modules, the U.S. can be known for taking advantage of international laws as well and finding loopholes around those international laws. And if they were to intervene within Russia, who says that wouldn't happen and they wouldn't find loopholes around international law and find a way to harm civilians within Russia as well? I think it would be best if the U.S. would not include military force because it risks endangering civilians. Another claim that was focused on within his video was talking about how the U.S. using military forces against Russia would not violate international law because they would be acting under self-defense. Unfortunately, I do not believe that is true. Since Russia has not directly used forces that affected the U.S. would not have the right to intervene because that will also violate international law and that will violate Article 51 as well. And under Article 24, as I stated before, they would not have permission either. The U.S. military or the U.S. would physically need to be attacked by Russia for them to be able to use self-defense and use their military when dealing with Russia. The same can be said for NATO as well, or NATO, however that is pronounced. Instead of resorting to using military force, I think there are other alternatives to protect humanitarian laws in both countries. For example, if we know that U.S. are siding with Ukraine within this war, so they do things like send their resources to Ukraine or offer refugee within the U.S. So I think those are other alternatives they can use instead of just straight focusing on using their military force, because that will only cause problem. And although Russia is violating international law, the U.S. would be violating international law as well, and this wouldn't be good for any sides within this conflict, and that would just only cause more conflicts, and millions of individuals would get hurt between these wars. So it would be ideal if they weren't to include themselves or their military force within it. I do believe that the claims that was made within the initial video were great, and it was very understandable, like Russia is violating international law, but they wouldn't have right, the U.S. would not have right to use their forces because they have no actual reason to. We were never really affected by Russia. They haven't used military forces or strikes against us, so we wouldn't have a right to use our forces on them. neither would NATO as well. So thank you for listening to my rebuttal, and hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.